Welcome back to my channel. My name is Jordan. I am an attorney. I talk all things law and I break things down and make them really easy for everyone to understand. Today we are talking about the Chrisley case. If you are not familiar, this case involves Todd and Julie Chrisley as well as their accountant. They are reality TV stars based in Nashville, Tennessee. They star in their own show, Chrisley Knows Best. They were indicted in 2019 on various fraud charges, and we are going to discuss everything you need to know. We heard some bombshell testimony in a 3-week trial regarding Todd's possible secret affair and his many schemes to commit fraud. So we are going to jump right into it. Let's get started. Let's start with their charges first. So Todd was convicted of bank fraud, conspiracy to commit bank fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and tax fraud. Julie was convicted of bank fraud, conspiracy to commit bank fraud, conspiracy to defraud the United States, tax fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. Now we're going to talk about why their charges were different. It is important to note that their accountant was also charged in this proceeding, but we're not going to talk about that. He was just charged in connection with some tax documents that were submitted and some other documents that were submitted on behalf of the couple, but just know that it's all related. Also note that this trial specifically involved federal charges. Their state charges were actually settled back with the state of Georgia years ago, so this trial was strictly federal. Now let's talk about a few legal definitions before we get into it. This will help you understand their charges and why they were ultimately found guilty, as well as just kind of clarify maybe some misunderstandings of certain things, such as a grand jury versus a petit jury or a regular jury. A grand jury cannot determine guilt. A grand jury determines whether or not to indict an individual or multiple individuals, whatever the case may be. So first, the prosecution presents its case, presents its evidence to the grand jury. The grand jury, after hearing the evidence, then decides whether or not there is probable cause to charge the individual or individuals with the crimes. So in this case, back in 2019, the prosecutors presented their case to a grand jury. The grand jury decided that there was enough evidence to charge Todd and Julie Chrisley with these fraud charges, and they were indicted. Now, when you are indicted, that does not mean you are guilty. You are still presumed to be innocent. Once the indictment happens, then the case can go to trial in front of a petit jury, which is a smaller group of individuals. That's the jury that we typically see when cases are heard. So in this case, the grand jury indicted the Chrisleys with these charges. They were still presumed to be innocent, and then the case went to trial, and the petit jury is the one who determined whether or not the Chrisleys were guilty or not. So one of the crimes that they were charged with was bank fraud. And essentially all this is a scheme intended to defraud a financial institution. Now, wire fraud is exactly the same as mail fraud, but requires electronic communication. So something like a phone call or emails, that is a requirement of wire fraud. You cannot be charged with wire fraud unless there was electronic communication involved. Tax fraud is intentional wrongdoing on the part of a taxpayer when it comes to an amount owed on taxes. To be charged with tax fraud, you have to have both a tax due and fraudulent intent. So if there's no tax due, you can't be charged with tax fraud. If there's no fraudulent intent, you can't be charged with tax fraud. There has to be both. Now let's talk about conspiracy, because a lot of people don't understand, how could you be charged with a crime but not conspiracy? Because a lot of people think conspiracy is just the thought of committing a crime, right? You conspire to commit the crime. You have a plan to do that thing. But actually, conspiracy requires 2 or more parties, because there has to be an agreement between those 2 parties to commit the crime. There also has to be some sort of overt act in furtherance of the crime. An overt act, it is a legal term, but essentially all it means is some act in furtherance of the crime. So what this means is that one person alone cannot be charged with conspiracy. There has to be 2 people, which is why you'll see later in my explanation of this case that Julie, the wife, was only charged with wire fraud and not conspiracy to commit wire fraud, because there was no other party involved in it with her. It was just her acting alone. So why are we here? When did this case start? This case actually started back in 2012, and the event that kind of got the ball rolling was Todd Chrisley's ex-business partner, Mark Braddock. And he left the company that he was partnered in with Todd, and he went to the government and he told the government, I have all of this information of all of these fraudulent acts committed by Todd, and I'm willing to give you all of this information in exchange for immunity. So he was given immunity, which is why you will see he testified in the prosecution's case against Todd Chrisley. And a lot of you are going to ask, well, if he's testifying he did all this stuff, why isn't he charged as well? Because he was granted immunity, which means the government cannot charge him in connection with these schemes because he offered his own knowledge in exchange for his immunity. That's just how this works. Now keep in mind that this case was investigated for 7 years before it was finally brought. So Mark Braddock went to the government back in 2012. The prosecution didn't bring this case until 2019 when they brought it in front of the grand jury. And then the grand jury indicted in 2019, and then it went to trial just last month in 2022. So this has been a 10-year long process. So how did the Chrisleys commit bank fraud? Let's just jump right into it. So essentially, they applied for loans with community banks in Atlanta totaling $30 million. And how did they get these loans? Well, what they did was they inflated their bank account statements, they lied on personal financial statements, they created false invoices, they created false auditing paperwork, and all of this was done to show that they were worth more than they really were. Because if they showed these statements in their true form, they never would have gotten the $30 million. They only got the $30 million because they showed the bank that they were worth way more than they really were. Their purpose in giving the bank these false statements and inflating their worth essentially was to show that the bank that they were a safe risk. They weren't a risk at all because they were really worth all this money. So in turn, the bank said, okay, well, these people aren't a risk to us, so we are gonna give them the $30 million. Turns out that he was a huge risk, and he spent this money on cars, travel, clothes, living his lavish lifestyle. And then what did he do? He declared bankruptcy, and he got out of paying about $20 million of those $30 million loans. So in order to prove that these inflated bank accounts, the false personal financial statements, all of this stuff were in fact untrue, the prosecution presented a few examples to the jury, and these were some of the examples that they gave. Back in 2007, when the Chrisleys were attempting to get one of their loans, Braddock, which is Chrisley's former business partner, sent a personal statement to the bank that showed that Todd Chrisley had $4 million in a Merrill Lynch account. In fact, Todd Chrisley didn't have a Merrill Lynch account at all at this time, and he didn't open a Merrill Lynch account until after this, and the most he ever had in this account was $17,000. So Braddock, remember, this is the guy that is the prosecution's key witness essentially. He's offering all of this information against Todd Chrisley. He presented an email in which he sent the personal statement to Todd Chrisley first to show him that the account, I believe, when he sent the original statement, it showed the Merrill Lynch account had $776,000 in it. And Todd wrote back to Braddock saying, you're an effing genius, just make it show 4 million. So clearly just coming up with some sort of fraudulent scheme. The next example that the prosecution gave was that a bank asked for updated financial information, from the information that they had had in the past from the Chrisleys, and Chrisley and Braddock sent the exact same information as they had sent 7 months earlier. And when a bank employee inquired into why this information had not changed at all, Todd emailed Braddock saying, just bring the securities down significantly. So this was further evidence just to show that this was all just a scheme. And then the last example I'm going to give you, the prosecution obviously presented far more evidence than this, but just for the sake of the length of this video, I'm just going to give you one more example. There was a time where the Chrisleys had to show proof of funds to a bank, and Julie, Todd's wife, sent Braddock a copy of a check and said the post date is the only thing that needs to be changed. So the posted date on that check was changed to a different date. So essentially the prosecution is just providing these many examples to show how the Chrisleys did in fact defraud many financial institutions. And like I said, they use this money to support their lifestyle, buy nice cars, buy clothes, they bought real estate. They used these fraudulent loans to pay back old loans. There's just a whole mess going on. And then, like I said, he filed for bankruptcy and he ended up not having to pay back that $20 million of loans. So now let's get into the tax fraud. So the Chrisleys actually failed to file tax returns for years 2013, 2014, 2015, and 2016. They didn't file taxes, they didn't pay any taxes, they just totally decided not to do it. Now, another thing that they did was Todd opened this company called 7 Seas Productions, and that is how the family was paid for their show Chrisley Knows Best. Well, because Todd Chrisley owed a significant amount of money at this time already in overdue tax, he put the bank accounts for 7 Seas Production in Julie's name so that he could avoid paying the taxes at all. And this is where their accountant comes into play. So their accountant was charged on separate charges for filing false tax returns and things along that nature. And it was all in connection to this 7 Seas Productions company. So they used the 7 Seas Productions company to hide their income. In March of 2017, Todd Chrisley told the IRS he didn't have the money to pay his taxes, when in reality, 7 Seas was receiving millions of dollars from their show's production. And like I said, Todd was avoiding paying this $500,000 delinquent tax bill by having the bank accounts for 7 Seas in Julie's name. And then one day, after the IRS inquired into why the bank accounts were in Julie's name and they wanted a bit more information, Todd Chrisley actually transferred ownership of the company over to his mom, Faye, who's also stars in their reality show. And Faye testified on the stand for the defense's case and essentially said that she's never been an owner, and if she did sign the ownership paperwork, she doesn't look at what she signs. She doesn't read what she signs before she signs it, so she didn't know about it, but she's never been an owner. So as you can see, it's a whole mess. So that is essentially a summary of their tax fraud charges. Now we're gonna get into the separate charges for Julie, which relate to wire fraud and obstruction of justice. So if you remember when I talked about Todd filing for bankruptcy, he did this in 2014. And during his bankruptcy proceedings, Julie made up false financial documents in order to rent a very nice home in LA. And shortly after they moved in, they stopped paying rent and the homeowner had to file a lawsuit to evict them from the property. So this is where Julie's wire fraud charges come in. Now, this is why in the beginning of the video, I said that there's no conspiracy to commit wire fraud because she did this herself. They didn't prove that, or they didn't have enough evidence to show that there were 2 parties involved in this scheme. You know, there was an additional person involved in this scheme other than Julie in order to bring a charge for conspiracy. So that's why it's just a charge for wire fraud and not conspiracy. And then when Julie obtained her obstruction of justice charge was in 2019. After learning of the grand jury investigation, Julie submitted a fraudulent document in response to a grand jury subpoena to make it appear that the Chrisleys had not lied to the bank when they transferred ownership of 7 Seas Production to Todd's mom, Faye. So submitting a fraudulent document to a grand jury is obviously obstruction of justice. It honestly blows my mind that she would even attempt this. I mean, you're already in tons of trouble. Why are you gonna keep creating false documents? Blows my mind. So in connection with this, the prosecution essentially asserted that this was done with the intent of impeding the grand jury's investigation into her and her husband and avoiding prosecution. Valid. So that kind of sums up their bank fraud, tax fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy charges, obstruction of justice charges, and that's all of that in a nutshell. The government put on 27 witnesses during trial. The defense put on 16 witnesses. Todd and Julie did not testify themselves. There was only one rebuttal witness, which was an FBI special agent. Essentially, the role of a rebuttal witness is to rebut any testimony given in the defense's case. So the prosecution presents its case first, the defense then presents its case, and then the prosecution can present a rebuttal witness and, you know, to rebut all of the things in the defense's case, essentially. Now, the government's key witness was Mark Braddock, as we talked about, who testified. This part is interesting. He testified that him and Todd Chrisley had an affair, a secret affair, for about a year. So Todd's defense and Julie's defense was mostly based on the fact that this guy, Mark Braddock, just wanted revenge. He was, you know, obsessed with Todd. He wanted to be Todd. He was upset at their breakup. He was left in shambles, essentially, in 2012 when he left the company. Him and Todd were no longer together, and he wanted to get revenge on the Chrisleys, and so he made up all of this stuff and went to the government and said, here, I have all of this information on the Chrisleys, and it was all made up. That was the defense's case, essentially. And obviously we know that the jury found that to be not consistent and eventually found them guilty on all charges. Sentencing will take place on October 6th at 9:30 in the morning. Now they could face up to 30 years. I don't see this happening. The fact of the matter is that they have a minor child who's 16. They also have custody of Todd's granddaughter, who's a minor. So I think we're gonna see not nearly that kind of prison time, and I think their prison time is gonna be split. So I think they'll each face maybe 2 years max. I don't see it being longer than that, but you never know. The Chrisleys are free on bond, but they were placed on home detention and location monitoring, meaning they can only leave the house for certain reasons like work, medical appointments, and court appearances, and they have to report to their probation officer anytime they spend over $1,000. So that is the Chrisley case in a nutshell. A lot happening. We won't know what their jail sentence time, if there even is jail time, we won't know their sentence until October. But I hope I made things very easy to understand. Please let me know if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'm more than happy to help you understand things further or answer any questions. So thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.